Welcome to the Meaning Code. I was contacted recently by Kathryn Oliver, and you're going to be meeting her in just a moment, but I wanted to show you something of what Kathryn is doing before we get started with our conversation. She is working with an art collaborative to produce some very, very interesting work. So I'm going to share screen here and bring up a trailer that they're using to present their work. And we're just going to look at about a minute and a half of it.
Little pretty bird, fly, fly away, little pretty bird, and pretty always stay. Everything in the universe began with a yes. One molecule said yes to another molecule, and life was born. Yes, 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 said the sun, yes. After all, we are partners in this land, co-signers of a covenant. At my touch, the wild braid of creation trembles. People are going back and forth across the door sill where the two worlds touch. The door is round and open. Don't go back to sleep.
I thought that was just lovely. Don't go back to sleep. It reminded me so much of Piranesi, where the door between the two worlds is open. The door between the two worlds touches. Seems to me like what Kathryn and her collaborative are doing is trying to re-enchant the world. So I'm looking forward to talking to Kathryn. I hope you all enjoy our conversation. So Kathryn, we're really glad to have you here today. And as I mentioned before, Kathryn Oliver is joining us, and you're here to talk about the art collaborative that you're a part of. And I'm really looking forward to hearing a little bit about your background, and not only your background, but kind of how you got to the place where you started the collaborative, and then what got you to our little corner of the internet. I guess that's what really interests me. So
yeah, that's an interesting little journey. Well, as far as art making goes, I've always done it. It was a very natural place to go. And we actually didn't have a lot of art supplies when I was a child. So it was just something that kind of I followed and continued following. But I think one of the most important moments was when I discovered C.S. Lewis' Chronicles of Narnia, and that was in 5th grade. And I think what it did, and if you remember in those books, there's not many images. There's just like a little sketch before each chapter. But I think what it did was it made me realize that the way he unfolded the story, my imagination started to conjure ways to animate it or to connect with it. And it really just opened the door to, making things. So that said, mostly I've just worked alone in my studio creating work. But about 13 years ago, it was funny because I took a dance class with this woman, Kristi Williamson, who I didn't know about yet. And I was in an interesting time in my life where I was just really open to like, oh, okay, I don't know what's next. And she taught a world dance class. And there was something in the different music and the different ways that the architecture and the body, just like it woke up all these new thoughts in me. And I thought, wow, this is so exciting. And I thought, you need to come to my house. And I want to share with you my paintings that I'm working on, because I want to take them out of a painting and into a theatrical kind of landscape. So I had invited 2 other dance choreographers as well. But it was a blizzard here in Maine, and I lived out in this on a hill, a very like treacherous hill. And so the other 2 canceled, and Kristi showed up, and she just like drove through the snow, showed up. We actually lost electricity that day, so I made wood fire out in my studio, and we just started to I don't know, it was just like this great energy that erupted between us as we started to work on the story ideas I had, the images I had, and then those grew into large puppetry. And then we started to collaborate in dance and music and theater. And we've just gone forever down that route now. It's just like a regular kind of, we meet a few times a year and work on these projects. But they're based in, what are they based in? It's like we're trying to tell a story of patterns. And so we're working with different poetry, music, storylines, folk tales, and kind of weaving you on a journey so that you are going to, it may seem like these things aren't connected, but as you go, it starts to kind of show what it is that you're journeying towards. I don't know if that makes sense. It's the kind of thing where when people ask me what we do, it's really hard to explain, because it's an experience, really. I mean,
well, that's the way I feel about my whole channel, is that people say, what's your elevator pitch? And I can't explain. There's 200 hours on there. I mean,
right.
No, wait, there's 200 episodes. So there's 400 hours on there for anybody who wants to follow the thread. But it's the thread is something that's moving along inside of my head, and I can't put that all together into an elevator pitch. I mean, right. I need to, but I haven't figured it out yet. So what you're doing, you said, is telling a story of patterns, weaving a journey, and then showing the connections. And
I think it goes back to like, so I didn't have any traditional religious upbringing. So when I was a young person, I was reading, like my generation, it was like the Judy Blume novels, the, like How to Eat Fried Worms, or all these like silly things. And then when I read the Chronicles of Narnia, it was like suddenly it was like a kinship with a world that was alive. And I was just like, I really like this Aslan, not knowing anything, right? It was just like this attraction. And so, always feeling that there was the good, the beautiful, and the true that we were always trying to repoint back to, right? But without, so one thing one of the first things that Kristi and I bonded on was that when she came into my studio, I had painted a quote by the Persian Sufi Rumi over my doorway. And it was like, out beyond ideas of right and wrong, there's a field, I'll meet you there. Of wrongdoing, there's a field, and I'll meet you there. And she comes in, she's like, I've been working with the poetry of Rumi, and this was, like 13 years ago, so it wasn't as popular. And so we both just started to connect with this idea. So what is it that this Persian poet is why is the dance that he's playing with so exciting? And yet it's like not pointing at ourselves, but it's including us and pointing past ourselves to something higher, right? And it's very embodied. I don't know how familiar you are with the Persian poets, like the best known are Rumi and Hafez. And they come from a tradition that is 12th century, it's quite a way back, but it's like, for me, it just felt like home. And as much as the Chronicles of Narnia did. And mm-hmm. so she's coming from more of an Eastern tradition. She lived in India for a year, and she went to musical theater, had a background in musical theater. So she's very professional. She's a really gifted human being. And then she kind of left that and went through this sort of Eastern path. And after that, she and I met. And then we started to work on all these things. And for me, I really attracted to stories. So in the patterns in stories. So I love the work that Jonathan Pageau is doing. And actually a couple of years ago, I had reached out to him and asked him to help me with the story. And it was really, because I thought, how does he know this stuff? Like, that was what was the most interesting thing to me, because I know a lot of artists who are very intelligent human beings, but they don't understand symbolism. Like, they don't, I can't explain it, but they just don't understand what's underneath things. They seem to be more concerned about the top. You know, so political art is really popular in kind of the milieu of the people I know. And anyway, so I just like feel like that was the thing that got me the most jazzed, and bringing that to the table. And then Kristi she would bring her dance and her own natural intuitions, and it was this really great synergy that happened between us.
So I told you I showed a little clip of the trailer for your long program that you did.
Yeah.
And I believe that was Kristi that was doing the dance.
Yeah, so it's a one-woman show that Kristi performs.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So everybody can know who Kristi is because they've seen her already. Yeah. And I could tell she's a professional. There's no question.
Oh, yeah. Amazing. Yeah.
Yeah. So you're attracted to stories, and it's really interesting that you reached out to Jonathan. Was he able to help you with the story?
Yeah, because this was before he, you know, the rocket ship to stardom for him.
Oh.
So yeah, so I had heard just when he had that conversation with Jordan Peterson, and just to backtrack a little bit. So I also, you talk about how you like to paint and listen to kind of educational programs or whatever, right? I also love to do that. So I was up here painting in my studio and listening to, you know, philosophy lectures and kind of scooting around the internet, finding these interesting things. And so I had listened to Jordan Peterson's lectures, Maps of Meaning, probably for about a year and a half before he kind of got really famous or whatever, you know, kind of disrupted the world. And so when he had Jonathan Pageau on, that's when I was like, how does Jonathan know these things? And I had never even heard of Eastern Orthodox Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
So, but at the same time, I'm also a big gardener. And about probably about 20 years when I started gardening, when I moved to Maine, I started to have all these visions of Mary and working in the soil. And I had a clay studio at that time. So I just started making these female figures, and like, I don't know why. And then they always had like snake serpents at the bottom and then the butterflies at the top. I mean, they're just very archetypal. And so, so it was like in me to understand it just intuitively, right? That there are these forces, this architecture that we're imitating or emulating or trying to move towards, that are always working on us in different ways. And then I went to Europe with a friend of mine, and I was really moved by the icons that were in, we went to Florence, and they were in the Accademia, like above, like we went to and saw all the great works of the Renaissance, which were incredible. Mm-hmm. But I was really moved when we went upstairs, and there was a beautiful gallery that was of these icons that were from probably the 1300s. So they were like just pre-Renaissance, like early mid 13, so mid 1400s. And they were very symbolic, and they were very abstracted, you know, so they weren't naturalistically done. And I just really connected to it. So then, you know, hearing what Jonathan was saying, like thinking, God, how does he know this? I started to follow that path, and then going down the Eastern Orthodox Byzantine world icon, I was just so thrilled. So I ended up taking a course with George Cordes, who is from Athens, and he's a master iconographer. And so it was just the most random thing. So I end up at this workshop in Connecticut. I think I'm the only one who's not a Christian there, you know, like ready to draw icons. So it's the kind of thing where we just kind of end up in these spaces that some invisible thread pulls us there. And we arrive at these spaces. And anyways, all of that I'm bringing back into the work that I'm doing with Kristi, because she had then moved out to California. And then she and I came back together, and we put this show together that you saw the trailer that we did last fall. And we would like to do it again, like this new, it's a kind of work in progress, because it keeps kind of building. Each one builds on the last one. And so it's like it's like when something's coming to you, you can't quite, you're really kind of pulling it in, pulling it in, pulling it in, and then you play with it and bring it up, and then you put it forward, and then you rest it, and then you're like, oh no, there's a lot more to do there, and you pull it and pull it in. So that's basically what we've been doing over all this time. Yeah.
Well, so what you said that really stuck with me is that there is an architecture that we're trying to move towards.
Yeah.
And the more I've thought about it, the more I think that is just the shape of reality. That, I mean, and that reality is God, and that's a shape that he's drawing us towards himself so that we can align with him. And there is like an invisible thread. You know, early on when I first started listening to Jordan Peterson, he said this very mysterious thing when he said that interest is a very mysterious thing, because what is it that catches your interest? Because every person's interest is completely unique and idiosyncratic, and yet that interest is out in front of you, and if you follow it, it will take you lots of fascinating places. It'll be the great adventure of your life if you follow that interest that's out in front of you. He said it's kind of glimmering out there, like the word he used was phanesthai, which he got from, it's the Greek word that means phenomenon, but he was talking about it in relationship to Boss and Binswanger on one of his early lectures when he was at the University of Toronto. So this little phanesthai out in front of you, sparkling, gleaming, that draws you forward. And then he said, I think he was quoting Jung when he said, it's your future calling you forward.
Yeah, totally. That totally makes sense.
Okay, I mean, how can that be? You
right.
know,
well,
right?
You know, do you know the poet Rainer Maria Rilke?
I have read some of his stuff. Yeah.
There's a beautiful line that just pops in my head. Hopefully I'll say it right. It says, the future enters into us in order to transform itself in us long before it happens. The future enters into us in order to transform itself in us long before it happens. And without even knowing what that is, it creates I don't know, it's like, if you break it down, it won't make sense. But if you just allow it to be, it's like, yeah, we can all relate to that. Even when you say, can you say a little bit about your background? Well, I look in the back of my life and there's just a few things that shine, right? Like all the details are unnecessary, but the things that shine are, you know, well, actually the C.S. Lewis book is real, Chronicles of Narnia. But then when I was 15, there were 2 books I read. Now, I haven't read them since I was 15. So my memory is as a 15-year-old, as, you know, a 55-year-old looking back at the 15-year-old remembering, right? But it was A Clockwork Orange and 1984, George Orwell's 1984. And they made huge impressions on me. So it's really interesting because it's like, in 1984, what as a 15-year-old was the most upsetting was that there couldn't be love, personal love, and that we couldn't eat chocolate. Like those things were really like distressing, that this totalitarian system was going to take away those. And then A Clockwork Orange, I don't know how familiar you are with that. It's Anthony Burgess.
I heard about it at the time. I know they made a movie out of it, but
the book is very different. The film is a whole nother object. But in the book, it's like, what do you do about evil, the problem of evil? And in it, you have this terrible band of misfits that are doing these terrible things. And what ends up happening is one of them gets caught, and then they condition him through these technological coercion, futuristic techniques, right? And force him that every time, then they let him back out. And every time he encounters like someone attacking him and he wants to, retaliate, he's made ill, like he's ill because they force him to watch these bad movies or something. And I just remember thinking, you can't force the world to be good. And it always stayed with me, like no matter what, any good intention will be corrupted if it's forced. And so like those, and things stayed with me. And I think they've always kind of worked through whatever I was attracted to. Like you said, what Jordan Peterson is, things that shine. And so the poetry, the patterns, and the writers that really attracted me were always kind of wrestling with those same questions.
Yeah, I think that issue that you just brought up with Clockwork Orange has been something that's really affected my way of thinking about everything for many years too. And I don't remember where it came from, probably from my early, when I was quite young, I was reading a lot of history and economics, and I was quite struck with Frederick Bastiat's Natural Law, or The Law is the name of his book, but it's the idea of what is the natural law that we all live under, that it's just obvious. And part of that is this idea that sin dwells in all of us. And therefore, anytime you come up with a utopian idea that you want to impose on the rest of the world so that they can have the same utopia that you have in your head, it requires force. And that's the only way to make it happen, is to coerce everyone else to fall into your idea. And 1984, I did not read when I was young, but I read it when my daughter was in high school. So that was like in 2011. So I just read it like 11 years ago. Yeah. And I can imagine that it's a completely different book for an adult than it is for a young person.
Yeah, probably.
Because it's a deeply impactful book. And the impression that I got coming away from it was that this whole world that we're living in right now is just everybody play acting. Right. And that all the different political parties, they all have their angle, and it's all part of a corrupt system, and we're all being played, you know?
Well, and I think it's that artificiality, like that coerced artificiality that's so upsetting, and the idea that if you can't choose love to resolve or move through things, like all you're going to get is top-down force. Or like if we don't have a belief that that's a possibility, then this is what, this is sort of where we will head, top-down control. And so like, I think so I mean, that's the method of control then, right? We will not let you choose love because we know how powerful love is to overcome evil. Right, exactly. Right? And so, I mean, then you're going to get into like a whole, like, like a cosmic spiritual war with that. But even if you just look at it, like, we don't really believe that. Like you know what I mean? We like, if we did, we wouldn't want to wake up in the morning. If we really thought everything was so mechanical that the only way to have the world organized would be just to like have a mechanical system that everybody has to check their box, it really wouldn't, it would be too much. We still have to dream that the possibility of love is there to awaken that between each other, even in the most difficult situations. And that's why those stories are so exciting to us. Right. Well, at the end of the little clip that I showed of your trailer that you and Kristi put together, the last thing that she says is, don't go back to sleep. And I told you before we started that it sounded to me as though you are trying to re-enchant the world. And you said, yes, absolutely. Yeah. So, but the don't go back to sleep. I mean, first of all, that takes me back to The Silver Chair by C.S. Lewis. And and the prince who is enchanted by the evil green lady, and when he is, during the day he thinks everything is just fine, but at night he kind of wakes up and realizes, wait, I'm trapped here, right? Yeah. Well, to me, that the internet is kind of like that enchantment that we're living in right now. Not just the internet, but our political ideologies, all of these traps that we let ourselves get tied into, they're all keeping us asleep. Yeah. And we need to wake up. If we wake up, then we'll see the love everywhere. If we wake up, we'll see the beauty and the truth and the goodness. But as long as we're
suppressed in this sleep state, addicted to all the things that attract us, the dopamine hits from the internet and all that stuff.
But I think that you're right. Like, we all get glimpses, right? Even the most bitter person gets glimpses. Like, even the one who's given up on a lot, will hear a song of a bird, or put on some music, or look out the window and see the light hitting the trees. Like, it's a universal. So I think it's, let's see, where did I want to go with that? Oh, yeah. I think that what the internet has done, it has capitalized on our natural inclination to say, look what's wrong here, right? And then we're given these powerful images, and it's so easy to be swept up into just saying what's wrong in the world. And when we say what's wrong, it's like we lose a larger opening to have that moment, to look out, to hear that bird song, etc., to be touched by something. And so it's like it's like I'm so tired of hearing about what's wrong. It's not that I want some platitudes at all, right? Like that's actually really painful too. But I think that we are definitely stuck in a groove of saying, of failing to see the beauty in the world, even in the sorrow. I mean, one of my, actually, is it right here? This is a fantastic book. I don't know if you know this woman, Hillison. So this is an incredible book. And of course, I, keep going to it whenever things get challenging. But she was living in Amsterdam during the Nazi occupation. She ended up going off to the camps and tossing her memoir into a farm field. I think the story goes, and it's found. But you cannot open this book and not read where she's praising God, praising creation. It's incredible. And she's also a poet. So the writing is really beautiful. And yet she's dealing with one of the most difficult situations human behavior. And so I think when we go and we see that this is a continual, that this isn't new to our world, like our contemporary condition, to see that there's almost there's parallel worlds within our world. Like there's your world, you have something difficult to contend with, and it can bring a weight and a suffering and a pain, and then maybe later in the day something really wonderful happens, and you're suddenly open, you're it's all possible, or maybe that's just me as an artist, but there is something to all of us that, there's all these different kind of subpersonalities inside of us that are animated through different experiences. Even I'll have different things that will be animated as we're having this conversation, right? And I'm sure that's probably why you like to do the podcast, because you get excited because different parts of you are going to be animated with this curiosity and kind of exploration and potential. So if we're just being animated by bad news and overwhelming, I mean, we're talking about the worst news possible, right? Global environmental collapse, world war and suffering. These are these are as a single person, in the face of that, there's a helplessness that comes forward. But then when you start looking into stories and poetry, you start to realize that grief, then it gets moved into a place of possibility. Anyways, that's basically what we're trying to do with the show. Right. So weaving all these different passages. So basically, I'm not a writer, I'm an underliner. So I like to go and just, have quotes and, so all these things, and then realize I'm mapping something, that thing, like you said, Jordan Peterson says, that shines, right? It's shining. It's okay, here's the same thing being told in all these different exciting ways. And so how can we tell it then through the body? Because I think a big part of our problem right now is we're disembodied. Especially, I mean, we were disembodied before the pandemic, but then on top of it, with lockdown and the virtual world becoming the norm, it's just so extreme right now. So how can we tell these poems, take them out of a book, open them up, and Kristi can do it through movement, through spoken word, through dance, through the images. So it's this kind of back and forth. So not to disorient people that it doesn't make sense, but to disrupt just enough so that you don't go back to sleep, right? Like that you don't fully understand because it's coming a little bit quickly, but then the next piece reiterates the pattern that you saw in the piece before it, and so forth and so forth. And we did this before. I had people who came. We did 2 shows of an earlier version of this called Wax Wings, and I had people who came to both shows because they were like, "What just hit me? Like, I don't know, like, this thing that it's somehow opening. I don't quite understand why." And it's because I'm using some of the most incredible texts that I've ever come across in my life. It's so, they're so powerful.
Yeah, I really resonate with the whole idea of you being someone who maps things, that you're an underliner. That's the way I read all the time. And then the things that stick out to me, I'll be underlining and I'll think, oh, that goes along with what so-and-so said on that YouTube video that I was watching yesterday. And I wish there were a better way a better system we need a Dewey system for YouTube videos, because we don't do books anymore, right? But I hear something at 12 minutes and 43 seconds on Jordan Peterson talking to Kurt Jaimungal, right? And that quote is so perfect, but it's very difficult to do transcripts of these videos, very time consuming. And if you had a Dewey Decimal System of some kind where you just could write down a couple of letters and a number, that's the spot right there next to the quote in the book. Then later on, you could go back and put all these things together. I mean, I spend endless hours just trying to put things together so that I can follow a thread on a video when I'm talking to somebody.
Yeah, no, I totally get it, because it's like you said, it's like lighting up and you're recognizing it, but then they moved on to the next thing, and then it's hard to kind of bring it all together. But it happens. Like, it's like maybe we don't need too much information to do it with. Maybe we distill it with just a few things, but those others are also feeding it, because maybe too much is too much. I don't know.
Yeah, I definitely feel that. I was telling you before we came on that I've been on like a month-long hiatus, partly because I was trying to decide, should I continue with this YouTube channel or not? Partly because I was traveling, and then after I got back from traveling, of course, I got sick. I was sick for a week, and then I was really low energy for a week after that. So I don't know if I had COVID or not. I did test a couple times, and both times it came up negative, but I was sure exhausted once I started getting over it. So
well,
it's hard to know.
I mean, it's like, it's just, well, you're in a different, where are you anyway?
I'm in California.
Oh, you're in California. Okay. Well, this time of year in Maine is definitely challenging. And a lot of people get sick this time of year because it's just like, it's neither winter nor spring, so the bugs kind of jump between people. But I understand, like, when you start a project and there's an energy with it and it's really exciting, and I think that all these things have life cycles. So maybe it becomes the next thing, because if you always try to keep it what it is, it's not possible, because I don't think that's how reality works. Like it kind of bursts forth, has an energy, and then declines and has to either become something else or end there, or who knows, right?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. There is a life cycle, right? Because one of the reasons I kind of took a break was that I started to think, I've kind of lost the thread. I would say the first year and a half, I was on a roll looking for a certain path of all of these ideas that are fitting together. And then I couldn't always contact the people it's really hard to find people. It's really hard to get their email addresses. I don't know how you got Jonathan's. That's really interesting to me.
It was just on his website, but this was before. I mean,
before the status rocket.
Yeah, I wrote the subtitle "Beauty Will Save the World," and then I said, I don't know how you know what you know or whatever, but could you consult me on this project? And he wrote me right back. But that was, before he probably has a million emails a day. So I think the thing is, like, getting in there before someone gets huge. I mean, I even wrote Jordan Peterson. He wrote me right back once. Like those people are kind of on another trajectory, you know.
Yes, they certainly are.
Yeah.
But anyway, it takes time to find the people that you want to talk to, and then some of them are way too busy to talk to you, understandably so.
Yeah.
And so because I wanted to continue having content on my program, I started talking to people about things that were sort of peripheral. But then after a while, I started to feel like it doesn't really fit. So I guess I understand why people aren't really engaging with it, because it's not really what my intention was in the beginning. So I want to get back, and you're part of my getting back to my thing. Yeah.
So what is your intention? Like, because I've only watched a couple of your pieces. I really like the Mark Vernon one. That was really interesting. And the Paula, that was, and then when you guys got into the Pirsig, that was very, very interesting.
Yeah. So, well, my original intent, which it still is my intent, is to follow a thread of thinking that I've had this thread for like 20 years. And when I started listening to Jordan Peterson, it was like, oh, he's coming at it from a completely different direction, but it's the same thing. And it kind of fits with your saying that there is an architecture that we're all somehow trying to move towards. Okay. So that architecture in my mind is the same architecture that is used to describe art, the elements and principles of art. Every painting has line and uses sizes and shapes and colors and directions and values and textures. It's in every painting. But then each of those things is also governed by a whole range of qualities, like repetition or gradation or variation or balance or dominance or harmony or contrast. And those qualities have I can't think of the word, where you can go from a very small amount of it to a very large amount of it. You have a measure, and anywhere along that line. So there's an infinite amount of variability that's possible in every painting. That's why every pixel of every painting is a slightly different value, color, texture than every other pixel in that painting. And that the world lays itself out like that as well. And that that's not only true of just looking at the vista of the beauty of the world, but it's true about ideas, it's true about mathematics, it's true about physics. And so I've been speaking to scientists and philosophers, trying to see how much of that idea actually lays itself out at every level of reality. And so far, that's what I see when I talk to people.
So is that kind of what you're saying when Jonathan talks about fractal patterns? So that there's this pattern that points to the larger pattern.
Yes, it is the same idea as a fractal pattern, but the fractal patterns that he's talking about are, well, one kind of fractal pattern is just a visual pattern, like the Mandelbrot set, or like the edge of a coastline, or like a tree. Those are visual patterns, right? But those fractal patterns, as Matthew Pageau laid out in his book. Have you read that book, by the way?
I did get it, and I don't. For some reason, it's like my brain doesn't work with that book. But I haven't gone back to it. Maybe I will one day. But go ahead, yeah.
Yeah. So in that book, he's talking about patterns that lay themselves out in the Bible that also show up everywhere else in the world, not just in not just in creation, but in the events that take place throughout history. These patterns keep showing up in different places. Well, my contention is that these patterns, that this pattern of what has been observed in art through the centuries, which is what the elements and principles are. They're not something somebody designed or decided upon. They've just been observed throughout all history. That is another set of patterns that actually is part of the way the physical structure of the universe is created.
Yeah.
And this is why I like Stephen Wolfram, because he's a physicist who has this strange idea that everything comes from one simple rule, but that simple rule opens up into infinite complexity
All
to
right, I want to
create the
write this
world.
name down because my dad's a physicist, and what's his name?
Stephen Wolfram.
Wolfram. I'll ask him about him. Okay,
Yeah.
here, can I just like riff off of that and say what popped into my head?
Oh, please.
I'm thinking about, because I do think in those terms as well too. I mean, partly because I am going to a Orthodox mission chapel weekly now, and it's really interesting when we open up the like in the liturgy, when we go through the stories and like it's read and it's opened up, it's like I see that those are patterns, relevant patterns that are in the world. Like I don't see them as something like just a story in a book. And one of the people I really love is Yvonne Ilitch. Do you know him at all? He's a really interesting.
I have heard the name. He was a writer.
So he was well, he's a theologian and a philosopher, but he wrote he talks about the Good Samaritan. He says a lot of things that are really interesting and relevant for this moment, but one of the things he talks about is the Good Samaritan, and how in the story how the man who helps the Good Samaritan, like the others pass by, and the man who helps him, and he tells it so much better, but basically, it's so radical because he is from a different tribe. Like we can't even conceive of that, because there's no good that you would get from helping someone from another tribe. You would only get persecution. But he does that, and that he talks about how the translation is translated wrong, because it's originally that it comes from his gut, like he's embodied to respond, right? And so that in the embodiment, he says that's the freedom to choose who we love. And he talks about this as this incredible, radical, like new consciousness that comes in with that story. Because prior to that, we are told who to love, right? We can love each other, but it's within our own tribe. Not only that, it's not a concept, it's something that's embodied because it comes from his body. And it's like he just spontaneously does it, even at the threat of all the, external problems. And so I think about this a lot, because I think one of the things he says, there's an incredible interview with David Cayley that he does on David Cayley's podcast. And it's called The Corruption of Christianity. And it's a really long one, but if you like to paint and listen to things, it's so chock full of really powerful thoughts. But at the end of it, David Cayley asks him, so are we in a post-Christian world? And he's like, absolutely not, because what we're in is where the lie will become so obvious that only Christianity can come back in. And he talks about the importance of the friend, and he has like all these terms. It's I forget. I think it's conviviality, right? Where he talks about, because there's something that happens in small local relationships that's a living relationship that he is patterning from the Good Samaritan. That there's a strangeness that happens between two people when they're embodiedly connecting, right? It's like when Christ says, when two or more are gathered, like there's something new that enters the room. And when Kristi and I, we're so funny because we're very different, because she's this extroverted, amazing performer, and I'm this more, solitary artist that likes to come up with the scripts and the ideas, and then I bring them to her, and then she, with her gifts, opens them up, and there's something that enters the room between the two of us. And it's so funny because when we get in that space, we definitely leave the door open of not having it fully known, right? There's a trust, there's like an innocence that, like almost maybe like if you watch kids play like they're building a sand castle or whatever. Like there's no overlord. I mean, there may be even a bossy kid, but even that bossy kid is submitting to the energy of the project, right? There's something between all of them, that they're building something together. And I think that gives me a lot of hope, because when we turn on the news and we think about what we're up against, but then we think about, well, you go on a walk and you run into a stranger and you have an exchange and something like funny happens, what I mean? Like someone says something, and like sometimes strangers share more, than the person, than your housemate or whatever, it's like there's something in the exchange that then they maybe bring an idea in your head and you go home with it, and then that could lead to something else. And we don't understand these kinds of seeds that move between people.
Mm-hmm.
I guess those are some thoughts.
Well, that's one of the reasons that I think everybody, I mean, I know a lot of people say everybody is, Jordan Peterson says, not everybody is creative. That's a lie, but I think he's wrong. I don't often say he's wrong, but I think he's wrong about that, because creative is not something that you're born with. There might be people that have a more, sorry. There might be people that have a more creative bent than other people when they're born. And there might be personalities that tend to be more creative naturally. But the way I think about this is, the scripture talks about the gifts of the Spirit, that some people have a gift of faith, and some people have a gift of giving, and some people have a gift of administration. But all believers are called to wisely administer their households and their finances. All believers are called to give faithfully. All believers are called to have faith. But for some people, it's easier. So you have a gift, so it's easier. And creativity is like that. For some people, it may come naturally. Some people may need to work on it a little bit. But the reason I think it's so important that everybody works on it in their lives is that every life is so completely unique because of that person that you ran into on the corner, and that exchange that you had that nobody else will ever have, or that movie that you saw and you saw something else in it that anybody else saw in it, or that painting, you recognize something in there that no one else has seen. And the song that you were singing yesterday spoke to your heart in a way that no one else can know. And because of the uniqueness of the way that we all grow up, even children that grow up in the same household, they're not in the same household because now they've been in the household, so they've changed the household, so the next kid that comes along is in a different household in a sense. So we all have this, I call it the experiential DNA that makes up who we are, that's completely unique. And that means that everything we see and hear comes through our filter in a unique way and needs to be added back into the world through our unique eyes. And that's part of what I see you ladies doing with your work, with your stage plays and your documentaries and the visual work that you do, is to show people that we all can enter into this open space and receive from it what is idiosyncratic to each of us, but then we have to go out into the world and offer it back in some way, whether it's through the way that we cook, or the way that we garden, or the way that we write a poem, or the way that we take photographs, or whatever it is that we do. We need to invest it with this story that is unique to us so that everyone else can share in the beauty that we see.
Yeah, and this phrase comes to mind. This woman who did the Lion King, I forget, I think her name is Julie Taymor, but she said something I never forgot in an interview. She said that we wanted to create something that when people experienced, they didn't even know was missing from their lives. And I think there's something about a great poem or a great work of art, because the artist may not even be like an amazing person, but they're able to tap into that meaningful pattern, and then they're able to articulate it. but there's something about that which I feel like is keeping the world together, you know? And so each time we experience it, it's like we're no longer just staring at the bad thing, like caught, you know, because that's really the most undynamic place to be, is to just staring at what's happening in the world and reflecting it back. And I think about when Christ says, turn the other cheek, it's like, he's not saying be passive and don't think that that's not important. I mean, to me, it seems like open up to a larger possibility that you, as your unique, as you said, idiosyncratic self, will take that and then bring it into your heart and then create something out of that, which will feed the world, you know. And you certainly see that with all the artists that have come before us, that there's that they've left these breadcrumbs, right, that then we can then dance with, and then we can share. I mean, I just think that we don't understand the gifts we've inherited from the creative people in the past. We take them for granted, you know, like, so I think when we're able to actually wake up with them, kind of all the parts of ourselves that are stuck kind of melt off, right? And can kind of shake it off and be open with you know, just create that space. We don't know what's going to come in, right? It's going to be different for each of us, but we create a space for that opening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really like what you're talking when you talk about, like, the least dynamic place is to be focused on that dark spot, to be focused on the negative, or to be focused on whatever terrible thing is happening right now.
And you see it because, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but you almost can predict what someone's going to say.
Mm-hmm.
Like, because it's become slogans and you know, just reiterating the same patterns. So it's not, and then you feel constrained because you're socially ostracized if you don't do that. So it's like, it's actually like you're a garden that can't grow, right? You're just like, there's no sunlight for you. You know? It's like, yeah, so sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, that was exactly what I was going to say, is when Jordan Peterson talks about the kind of getting locked into an ideology means that you have nothing new to say, you have nothing new to bring, because it's all the same terminology, depending on which ideology you're a part of. It's very predictable, right? But I don't know if you're familiar with John Vervaeke.
Yeah, so I've listened to a lot of these things since I'm in my paper studio.
So with John Vervaeke's work, he talks about this reciprocal narrowing that takes place when you get into this space where you're trapped, where it's like an addictive process where your world gets more and more narrow. And that's what I see happening to these folks that are trapped in these ideologies. But the same thing can happen to us even in a relationship, even in a small local relationship. If you get fixated on that one black spot on the piece of paper, rather than being able to look at everything else about the individual, all you can see is that one negative, and it just gets more and more irritating.
Yeah, and you almost like it's like you're not seeing any complexity, just a caricature of the person, right? And we're all guilty of that. Like it's really easy to get caught in those emotions and just shrink that person down to that one thing you don't like about them, you know. But I think that's the wisdom of the, like, the Persian poets. I mean, and also any great intuitive artistic expression, whether it's a parable or it's the Persian poets. But there's a style of poetry, and I'm not an authority on it by any means, but it's called ghazal. And it's gazelle. It's let me see, I think I have it right now. Ghazel. Ghazal. But it was in the Middle East, they would do these poems so that they would have a certain amount of syllables that you could use. Like, I don't remember, but it's like 20. And then you have to switch subjects. And then you can use 20, and then you switch subjects. And so they're switching subjects throughout the whole poem, right? But they're not switching the subject to disorient and fragment you, which is basically what I feel like what we're getting now. It's like COVID, war, like, ice caps melting. Like, it's like, but those are completely fragmenting, but they're switching subjects to point everything to remind you to go back to the good, the beautiful, and the true. So this is Hafez is very famous for his style of writing in this way, or it wasn't written, it was probably oral and written down by listeners. But I find it really helpful to go back to that kind of style, because it helps us get back in our body, switch off the, what did you call it? Narrowing, the narrow view, and open us up to something. I mean, you can do it like, we do it when we have to like cool off and go for a walk, when something really difficult's happening. Like, we just do it instinctively, and then suddenly you're in this encounter with, the sound of the birds, or, the energies out there, and the light in the tree. Like, there's so many things that are just pulling you out of that tiny little view,
Yeah, the other place that I think that shows up, that one little spot on the page, is in the garden with Eve, because God says you can eat of any tree in this garden. Here's this beautiful garden that's laid out for you. Everything is there. It's all beautiful. It's all fruitful. It's all delicious. It's all yours.
Yeah.
It's just one. And I'm warning you away from that one. I have a good reason, because I love you, right? But there's just this one place that you mustn't go. Well, that becomes the only thing you're interested in, right?
Well, and I wonder if it's because, like, we just have such a drive to want to know what the world means. Why are we here? And so it becomes this obsessive kind of OCD thing. So Eve can't handle not knowing and goes to the tree. That's her demise. But there's something Jonathan said that I loved, I never forgot, where he says that, and he talks about Eve, and then he talks about Mary, and how Eve takes the apple and how Mary receives the fruit, and how both of those are totally different gestures. And if you just apply that idea to like every difficult situation you've ever been with. So if you try to, like, say you're arguing with, somebody, if you try to impose your will on them to win the argument, it doesn't go well. But if you allow something to come, like, just like, gotta cool off, gotta come from a different point of view, stay open, it's like there's a resolve that somehow shows up. It's very interesting. And I think this, like, wanting to know everything, like, I'm so guilty of that myself. Like, I want to know, like, why are we in the situation we're in? What's happening? What does it mean to be here? And I listen, and I think, and I think, and I think at some point I'm like, oh my God, just stop thinking. And then something new can arise. It's like, you probably have this experience when you're working on a painting, like, you just don't know you got to just get away from it, sleep on it, go for a walk, and then you come back and it just starts to flow again.
Yes, absolutely. And when I think about Eve in the garden, Eve taking the apple, I think that taking is a function of not trusting, right? Because if she had trusted God, then she would know that he had given her what she needed. Everything that she needed was right there. And she didn't need to take something for herself that wasn't offered to her. Where Eve receives the fruit. I mean, Mary receives the fruit.
She totally trusts, right? Because she, even though she knows how painful this is going to be, she still says yes.
Yeah, she still says yes. So basically, Eve is saying, no, you're not enough for me. This other guy has this other thing that he's going to give me, because you're not enough for me. Even though you're offering me all of this, that's not enough for me. And so she's not trusting. So to me, I think all of the thing about the fall and the sin and everything else can collapse down into this issue of trust or no trust. And that's kind of the picture that I get. And
it's true, because I think that, I think of it like, when bad things happen personally to us, I think it's always good to take these abstract ideas and bring them to your own, like, okay, let's look at what happens here. Like, if I try to, like, control and, like, react or whatever, it doesn't help. But if I just say, okay, well, this is just happening, like, okay, and you can grieve, like, not saying don't grieve. I think grieving is really important,
Yes.
but also just stay open. Like, this thing is there's a loss here. So just, trust. I guess it does come down to trust. And and I know when I look back in my life and things that, like, I didn't want to have happen, I was really upset at the time. I can look back and see there was like an invisible thread that was running the whole show, as if it was orchestrated. It was somehow allowing parts of us to participate that we hadn't known we were even capable of, right? It awakens new parts of us.
Mhm.
And so I think that, in a way, that, yeah, everything's moving towards the good, the beautiful, and true. And often we learn a lot from our mistakes, right? From moving away from it, but it's not a static good, beautiful, and true. It's like an eternal but always dynamic unfolding good, beautiful, and true, because each person and each of our experiences are going to be dynamic and unique, right?
Yeah, it's so interesting to see how all of that works through the artists that have come before us. Like you said, we're not aware of the gifts that have been offered in the past to us so often, or if we do, we only know one little piece of it, the thing that grabs our interest, but we don't see the great foundations that are underneath all the rest of it. And I don't know if you know who Andrew Clavin is. He has just written a new book called The Truth and Beauty. And it's his exploration of, he was having trouble understanding the Sermon on the Mount. It just seemed so upside down to him. And so he began exploring back through the Romantic poets. And then he wrote this book about what he learned from the Romantic poets that helped him to understand the Sermon on the Mount better. I'm about halfway through. And it's so interesting because he's not a part of this little corner of the internet at all. And yet he's talking about all the same things.
Yeah,
And
it makes sense.
Yeah, he's talking about them through the filter of the Romantic poets. But the way he did it, he goes back and he tells the story of just these odd occurrences that happened in the lives of the Romantic poets, and how they just sort of happened to connect up with each other. And then out of that came these works that are now a part of the oeuvre that drives so much of our thinking, right? The story he tells about Mary Shelley and the writing of Frankenstein is just fascinating. I mean, it would never have occurred to me that that's how Frankenstein got written. And so it's really a great book. And I'm hoping, I'm trying to have him on the conversation to talk about the book when I finish it. Yeah.
Well, and I think, I mean, for me as like a teenager, like the Romantic poets were so appealing to me.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, I mean, they're definitely reacting to the world becoming so mechanical and like everything becoming an object. And but there is this, like, when I was in high school, we studied Ode on a Grecian Urn, John Keats. And it's so funny because I always kept it with me. Heard melodies are sweet, but those unheard are sweeter. But there's something like kind of nihilistic about that. And I think it appealed to me in my like youth, right? But I was like, I don't know if it's nihilistic, but it's something where it's like, well, we'll never hear that sweet melody. Like there's it's just a dream, like that we'll never get to. But I feel like when I like Christianity is that, right? It's that promise that it's there. And certainly I definitely, I feel it in the Persian poets as well. I mean, there's a poem that called I forget the title of it, but it's by Rumi, and it says, it's like a conversation. He says, why did you stop praising? He says, because there was no answer, because there never was an answer. And then the conversation continues and says, your longing is the return message. And there's something like that in the longing, we have this shared connection. and I don't know what that means, but I just know that in a beautiful song or a sad poem, or like you hear an amazing story, there's a sense of like, instead of that narrowing, right, that we talk about when we're getting kind of news headlines, there's this opening, and something wants to kind of participate in the opening. So in the unheard melody, yeah, sure, okay, so we're not going to arrive, but we are participating with something unfolding, right? So there's just this really interesting dynamic potential that we're always engaged in. I think the problem is when we aren't tapping into that, it kind of retrogrades on itself, right? Because it's like we're made to, I think that's how we're made. Like we're creative creatures, right? If we're not going to create, we're going to destroy. And so that stagnancy of just mimicking the bad news and the sort of decadent kind of like, oh, there's no meaning, etc. It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy, because we're just animating that kind of world. We're just like kind of giving it more strength. But at the same time, you can take a sorrowful tale and feel open. Or even, my friend was like, why do you read so many sad things? And I'm like, reading this Eddie Hillison, and I'm like, it's not sad, it's like incredibly redemptive and hopeful, because if she can do that, she can like, bring the spirit of that to the most difficult situation, like that's even possible, is amazing.
Yeah. So many things I want to say. First of all, going back to the idea about the longing being the return message, that reminds me of it's C.S. Lewis. I think it's in Mere Christianity, where he talks about it's the longing that we have for a better world that tells us that there is a better world.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It's the glimmer. Yeah. And that makes me think about hope. And I think it's Gabriel Marcel that talked about hope not being desire, but being will.
Right. So it's like an action. It's like a participatory kind of movement.
Yes. And then will comes into play with love as well, because love is to will the good of the other. So when you're hoping, you are actually willing for the good to come into being, right? And then faith is the substance of things hoped for. So the hope is something that we are actively willing into being, and faith fills that out and becomes the substance of it. Yes. And then that makes me think about John Vervaeke when he talks about a mother and a baby, and how the baby is just an undifferentiated being, but the mother loves that baby into being a self. That the baby is not a self, is not a person without the mother's love pouring into that baby. And in that way, the hopes that she has for that baby's future become a reality through this willing the good of the baby. Her love is so. That whole thing just ties together.
Beautiful, and I think that goes back to the friend too, because there's a and this is I keep thinking over and over, is like the world is built on relationships, because the mother and the baby are in a dynamic relationship with each other, and in the best case scenario, it's love, and of course we feel like when it's not love, it's wrong. So something in our heart says the correct way is love, right? And so that is going to form the child. And you had sent me that line, I think, in our email exchange: faith is the substance of things hoped for, and then the next line is like, of those things unseen, or something like that. But I used it in my email I sent out with a picture of my garden, because I had never gardened before I moved to Maine. And when I moved here, I took some classes in permaculture and herbs and biodynamic farming. And I just was like, I was like writing, I was like, okay, tell me exactly what to do. I have no idea what to do. I didn't even have a window box. But anyway, so I did everything he said, but then I created it like a painting. Like it was this giant canvas that, like, literally I couldn't wait to wake up in the morning and go out there and I put a pond in. I made these clay sculptures everywhere and bentwood fences. And before that, it was just a fallow field, right? It was just like people just mowed it, and we moved there and made this. And the garden was like, it was unbelievable. I didn't even know I had it in me to make that, because before that, I didn't know how to garden, right? But there was something that in this blank canvas and the excitement now, and I often use garden as a metaphor because I have to prepare as the garden, the soil and so forth, but I'm not in control, right? I'm participating with something that's arriving. So the plants are arriving, I can choose them, I can start my seeds, I can do a lot. There's a lot of control, but then sometimes I'll wake up and I'll go out there and they're, like the most perfect thing landed just where it looks amazing, like a calendula next to, like little purple violets, and it's like the orange and the purple. And I'm like, how did it know to go there? Or I had one year this beautiful mullein, mullein with these really tall, roadside plants, but they're really powerful and beautiful, just like land next to the pathway and the entrance. Like it was like a, kind of an ambassador of the garden. And I ended up being on this big garden tour, and like literally I was so like new at this. But I was like, okay, this will be fun. And so, hundreds of people came to walk through the garden, and they're like, that was such a good idea to put the mullein there. I was like, these things, I think a good gardener just knows what to leave and what to kind of take out. Anyways, long story short, I think the gardens taught me that it's a combination of leaving enough wild and enough cultivated. Like that's the most dynamic garden, because if it ends up being so wild, it's just a mess, and the plants don't thrive, and there's snakes, and it's less pleasant. And if it's so contained and ordered like a gas station garden, it has no soul in it, so it's this. And I think that's true with everything.
That illustration of volunteer plants is so good. I've had the same experience where the most interesting things will volunteer in my garden. I have a big tree in my backyard that's completely volunteer. It has nothing to do with anything that I would have ever put there,
But you have the good sense to leave it. And so I think this is the thing. So, I mean, maybe I'm going off a little too much, but like, what if we're being communicated with all the time and we just are shut off from it, right? Because we're just so focused on like, this is how it is and this is what it looks like,
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's absolutely true. There was something else when you were talking about the longing being the return message. There was something else that came to my mind and then it disappeared, but maybe it'll come back. Obviously, you and I have to talk again sometime.
Yeah, I love that. I would love that. I had a quote here because it's kind of like a non sequitur, but it was one I came across that I really liked. All right. So part of the reason is I grew up without any, I didn't even know anything about Christianity, except I thought it was just kind of a repressive, boring, static, like old thing that needed to be tossed off, and then it just came to me. I told you in these images, and then I was like, I love that lion so much, and I didn't realize it. And I grew up listening to gospel, reggae, and blues, so I didn't realize that my aesthetic was Christian, right? Like everything that I was drawn to artistically was this pattern. But it felt so disembodied to me. And so that's why I like to, I went to the Orthodox church here in Bangor just to kind of observe, because I was just like, what's going on? I want to just observe. And then now I go regularly, so it's funny. But this is a G.K. Chesterton quote. And I thought it was something that he said that's really beautiful, because I'm a gardener, and most of my friends are gardeners. Most of my friends are artists. I'm just like, this is kind of the people I've gravitated to. And most people are uncomfortable with Christianity. They'll have everything else on their altar besides Christian. Like it's annoying, but I get it, because we're just conditioned. It's so silly. But in a way, I feel like they're so right for it, because they're already embodied. They're already working with the patterns, not realizing it. And so this is from G.K. Chesterton. And I thought this was really interesting. He says, Christianity requires us to be more and not less pagan. with respect to the positive life-affirming aspects of paganism. In the same way, Christianity requires us to be more and not less attentive to our bodily senses in order to fill their infinite capacities, and yet to arise beyond even their astonishing compass. And what I love about that is, like, because I think we do, you know, especially now as everything is becoming so sterile and mechanized and abstracted. And we look at indigenous cultures and we're like, oh my God, they were part of the world. Like, we're outside of it. What happened? As a gardener, like, I'm in the soil, you know, I'm working, and it's like, it's just such a joy. And I just thought that was really, really exciting to read that.
Yeah, G.K. Chesterton is amazing. Well, in one of his books, I might be orthodoxy or it might be heretics. I'm not sure which one. He starts the book by talking about, he says, this was the opening paragraph of the book I never wrote. And then the opening paragraph tells a little story about, I believe it's going away from his home and then looking back on the hillside and seeing that there is a pattern on the hillside of a beautiful horse, that as long as he lived on the hillside, he never knew that pattern was there. But when he got far enough away, he could see that pattern. It's a great story. But what stuck to me was that line, this is the opening paragraph of the book I never wrote. And I read that probably 5 years ago, long before I ever started this channel. And at the time I thought I should do a blog called This is the Painting I Never Painted. Yeah. And tell the story of all the paintings I never painted, but paintings that were completely in my head. I could see them, but I never realized them in paint for one reason or another, quite often because it seemed outside my realm of possibility. You know, my fear kept me from working on it.
Well, yeah, and it's really hard. I mean, I think you get sense impressions, and then when you try to bring them in, it's incredibly difficult, right?
Yeah.
They're so full and beautiful and vibrant when they're behind this veil, and then you're like, come on. Yes. And then it's like failure.
Exactly.
You're like, oh, this is so disheartening. I mean, it just takes so much work. It's not, I mean, once in a while you can be gifted something, but often it's really, you know, it's a journey of reworking and trying to bring it in.
So show us some of your work.
Oh, okay. So I like to work really large. And so I was really inspired by the Byzantine paintings that I was learning from George. So this is a whole, what's interesting, let me grab a couple things. So what I liked about was there's this whole system that he teaches that is the relationship of the eyes to the nose to the in 3/4 view and like all this stuff. Now I just took this one class and kind of ran with it, and so I'm not doing
this was the iconography class.
Yeah, and so now I'm making these like little items, you know, that people can just hang on their wall out of the big paintings, and then the big paintings go out in this exhibition that we, you know, you can walk through and have an experience. But what I loved about them is these female figures, and a lot of times they're very elongated. That's the way his style of painting, and so they're very tree-like, and they have this sort of sorrowful. I mean, he's doing say a toko, so it's a sorrowful face, but the sorrowful face was really easy for me to connect with because it was sorrowful and yet really energetically well, it was a yes, right? So it was like this interesting movement between acknowledging the sorrow of the world and yet this incredible love for the world all at the same time. And so I've just been working with those kinds of images, which has been fun.
Could you show us the little one again and give us a little bit more than a second to look at it?
Okay, and then this is a really little one. They're hard to see probably in the video. But I have them on a little Etsy site now.
Oh, cool. Yeah. So give me that. after we're done, you can give
Yeah,
me
I'll send you the link because I don't even
links
think.
to your website and to your collaborative, and then to your Etsy site, because it would be fun for everybody to see.
Yeah, and you saw the little video I did about the process, because I'm repeating these patterns of like there's always these female figures with a dove flying out of their head, and kind of maybe there's like a wild storm at the bottom of the feet. But I think what we have is this very overly masculinated world. I don't know if that's the right word, but it's very masculine, not in the good masculine. It's like that we're forcing it to be. Like we have these desires, and so we're going to force those desires on the world. And the feminine to me is that open space of listening to what reality really is, and then participating from there. So you hear it and then you participate. And I definitely noticed that with the garden. Like I love to work intuitively with the garden, because I go out there, I have an idea, I have a plan. You can't be super, all over the place, but then that plan changes as you start to dig and embody in the soil. And I would say that's the same when Kristi and I work together, the same when I work on a painting. Like you don't know where it's going to take you, right? And it's very exciting. Yeah.
Yeah. So the idea about the world being masculinized, that's not, as I understand it, at least, that's not so much that it's the patriarchy that's the problem. It's that we're losing the feminine, because the feminine is always masculinized. The feminine is either completely sexualized as a sexual object, or else she has to be wearing 5-inch heels and running down the bad guy and kicking the crap out of him.
Yeah.
Right. So it's either one or the other, but there's no place for the feminine that listens and that's open, and that has a place for truth to be embodied, or for beauty to be embodied, because that's old hat. Now let's grow our babies in a test tube so that the woman doesn't have to suffer.
I mean, that's not going to go well. I mean, I think the whole thing about like the whole gender fluid thing is like the truth is we are fluid. I mean, when I'm painting, like I'm fluid, right? Like we're fluid. But the thing is, when you try to make that an object, when you try to like then make that static and artificialize that, and I have a lot of sympathy for people, because I think it's a very confusing world that we're living in. And that when you are in that like receptive, feminine, fluid state of being open and receiving, it's really like rapture. Like it's really beautiful, and it's fertile. And then you want that to be the answer. And so then you commodify it, you objectify it, and you try to make it stay, and it's just not going to work, because you can't organize it that way. It's too mysterious, right? And so I think it's a forever receiving, and then like it drifts away, and then you receive. And so if we can have ways to contemplate it in that way, I think we'll be less concerned about trying to hold it, but to trust and to allow. And I feel like this is basically what poetry does, that this unfolding is beyond a category, right? It's something that we can tap into, but we can't force.
Yeah. So whenever you talk, my mind just opens up.
Well, it's like you can have something that can work really well, right? Like you can have like a system that works really well. So you got a lot of local people together, and you're like, okay, we're going to have like, talk about art and philosophy night, and like, okay, you bring this and you bring that, and it works really well. And then you say, okay, I'm going to make this something that everybody should do. And then you make it sterile and overly organized, and then you try to, and then it loses. Like it can work for a little bit, but it has to come from the people that are, it's like receiving it and bringing it forward. And so this is why I think things can really effectively only work with reality on the local, and it could be local across, I think the Zoom thing can move into local, but whenever something gets so big, Like, I don't envy these people who, like Jonathan Pageau, I can't imagine holding this many people and being responsible for this many people. Like, what do you have to give up to do that too?
Mhm.
It would be a very difficult place to be. I mean, God love him. I mean, I think it's amazing what he does. He's really obviously called to do it. But
Mhm.
I think for most of us, it's like, look where the life is, look what's living here. And how can we receive it and share it with each other somehow creatively. So I think we're always trying to move to potential. Like, that's like the reason we wake up in the morning is like, there's potential here, right? um, so
So, so going back to the rapture, that experience of rapture, that being open and the experience of rapture, it made me think a lot about what has happened in the churches in the last, I would say, probably 30 years relative to worship music. Because there's absolutely no question. I've experienced this myself when singing certain songs, certain worship songs, where I feel that sense of rapture, where it's like something outside of myself is just interpenetrating me and filling me so full that I can't hold it, right?
mhm.
I remember one time, probably 35 years ago, in a tiny little church in St. Charles, Iowa, and we were singing the old song, Victory in Jesus. And I had one of those experiences, right? But then fast forward about 10 years later, I was kind of working as a worship leader in a church. And one of the opportunities I had was to go to a worship conference in Dallas.
Mhm.
And there were a lot of wonderful classes there on just how to open yourself up more to be a worshiper, to be a person of faith. And that was all good. But then there was one class on how to help the congregation worship. And it was this sort of package deal about the way that you present the song and the way that you make the beat work a certain way so that it fits in with the resonance of the person's spirit. And it
Yeah.
all got a little bit too much like this is a mechanical trying
It's
to
such a
reproduce.
modern concept. Yeah.
Yeah, it's trying to reproduce the rapture in people in
Right.
a mechanical way. And then I started to see that happening all around in a lot of these. You could hear it in the people singing, where instead of just singing authentically, their voices get very, very dramatic while they're singing.
And honestly, it's such a turn off. I mean, I think that's part of
Yes.
the, like, people, or for myself, was so turned off by Christianity because I just would, those are the pictures I had,
Yes.
and I think that we don't understand, like, a community or all these people that came before us who intuited and received and like wrote these hymns, like wrote this, contemplated these stories, shared it, and that's why I think this old liturgy is so powerful, because it's not diluted with the, like, we need to create the perfect worshiper. It just intuited it, and here it is. And that there's a tradition, like there's a power in a tradition, because it's alive and unique with each group that does it, but you're not messing with it, right? Because it's like, it's I don't know how to put it, but it's been wrestled with and evolved through all these people over a very long period of time, and so it's been participated with, but it hasn't been what do you call, like, here's the new model, what I mean? Like, it's like with respect to what's come before, right? It's like with reverence to what's come before.
Yeah.
And it's like that's the best, right? Is like to like recognize that, and then you bring your essence or your love for it. You don't remake it. You participate it, and if it's a gift, if it's an intuitive true gift, then that's going to be kept, and then that will come with the rest. But I mean, I'm just amazed. Like, each time I go through the liturgy and I hear it, and then, of course, it's embodied because we're singing it, and the incense and the icons. each time I feel like it reveals more to me, you know.
Mhm.
And there's times where I'm my head somewhere else, etc. And then I come back, and then it's just so interesting because it's not like something that is far away. It's something that I can apply in my own life, and like, you know, in my own relationships and my own contemplation. It's not far away.
Mhm.
And it's strange because it is like a puzzle. It's like in a puzzle for us to participate with. So we're doing something with the puzzle. It's very, very amazing.
Hmm. I've been thinking for a long time that I wanted to go visit an Orthodox church, and now you've planted that seed. I'm going to have to give it a
Well,
try.
and I'm sure you're gonna get every kind out there. I mean, I just happened to stumble on a situation that's really, really interesting and beautiful because I ended up going to this chapel that was like I wasn't there very long, but I ended up getting chrismated there. I mean, I went there for a year as an observer, and then I was like, well, I keep coming. And so I was chrismated right before the pandemic. But then when the pandemic happened, the church closed down for a really long time. So, and it was pretty far from me. It was like an hour and 15 minutes. But now, right near me, my friend who also attends that church, she opened this talk about idiosyncratic. It's a little mission chapel in her barn. So it's like a main barn on a hill, like next to her Victorian house. And it's so funky. And she was born in the Antiochian tradition. And so her father also had a chapel. And so we have a priest that comes, you know, once they try to come once a month, but it's basically just her family and a few people. And so it's very grassroots, which is
Mhm.
kind of my style. Like it's very local. It's very, you know, so I have some of my paintings outside and go, I should send you some pictures. We have like a little Instagram I put
Yeah,
together for it.
I
Yeah.
would I would love that, and I would love to see pictures of your garden too. It sounds just
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
completely enchanting. And just out of curiosity, have you heard of Michael Martin? He's a
Yeah.
biodynamic farmer and
Oh,
an author.
we actually talked on the phone.
Okay, because
Yeah, because I called him with the question. Yeah, yeah,
I had a
that's so funny.
conversation with him about his book Sophia in Exile.
Yes, yes. I thought that was really interesting. Yeah. Well, and so my background is in anthroposophy. So when my son was little, he went to a Waldorf school, and